Welcome everyone for joining today's deep dive on our annual Pharmaceutical Innovation and Invention Index. I'm Jackie Barendrecht, Chief Operating Officer at IDEA Pharma, and I'm joined today by Mike.
Hi folks, yeah, I'm Mike Rea, CEO at IDEA, and I'll talk a little bit about where the index came from when I get into it.
So really great that you've all signed up for today's webinar. And what we will be doing is really unpacking some of the insights and the rankings that have been published in the 2024 index that was presented at the Stat Summit last month. I hope you've all found also your way to the full white paper on our website. If not, feel free to drop a message in the chat and we can send you the link directly so you can get your own copy. And what we really aim for today is obviously bringing together like-minded people within the industry that are passionate about innovation, and also get your thoughts on what you see is working well or what might be challenging for companies to, you could say, achieve good scores in terms of innovation and invention. But most of all, we hope you will be able to walk away with some new insights and fresh thinking. So what we'll be covering today is first an overview of the Pharmaceutical Innovation and Invention Index, just to make sure we're all level set on what we're analyzing and how the data is being put together. Then Mike will deep dive in some of the notable 2024 results, obviously also really discussing, you could say, the companies that went to the top of the index and some that moved more to the bottom of the list. And then what's also interesting, as we are in our 13th year of the index, is that obviously we have a very rich data set on innovation and invention. So we've done some additional analysis to really look what do the top performing innovators in our industry, what do they do differently? What are the strategies that they have been implementing across more than a decade? So we'll be sharing that with you as well. And then towards the end, there's a Q&A, but we also would like to welcome you to use the Zoom chat for you to type any questions, and then we can pick those up either in between the meeting or in between the sessions or towards the end of the meeting. So first of all, an introduction to the index itself, which actually started, as I just mentioned, more than a decade ago, where we as an IDEA Pharma team asked ourselves, what if you would give the same drug to two different companies before phase 1? Would they be equally successful? I think people would like to believe that companies would be equally successful with the resources and capabilities they have, but ultimately the answer is no. And we see a huge difference in terms of how drugs in the same class or the same molecule have a very different performance from a commercial perspective in the market. So the real interesting question is, why? What does make that difference? And that's also what we're trying to answer with our Pharmaceutical Innovation and Invention Index. And invention and innovation are not the same. So everyone, I would say, would credit Edison for inventing the light bulb. But actually what he did was he built on different prototypes where already other inventors had been trying to come up with electrical light. And what Edison was able to do was to make the wire incandescent more accessible and make it use much less power than some of the other light bulbs that have been invented. So it's not necessarily about being the first or coming up with a novel idea. Innovation is really about creating meaningful value from your invention. And that difference is particularly important in the pharmaceutical industry, where we think about, you could say, on one side, the drug discovery process and finding novel targets that can help to treat unmet medical needs. But on the other side, it's also about the clinical development process and what we do from a commercial perspective that makes drugs successful. So just as a reminder, and it's important to keep these different definitions in mind as we go through the results of the index. So invention really focuses on, you could say, the pipeline and you could say the promise that companies have in bringing meaningful molecules to market. The innovation is really the return on invention and the creation of meaningful value. And that's something that we measure also through the sales generated per product. So when we look at innovation, we look at key metrics, and all of our data comes from public available data sources. So there's no, you could say, necessarily advantage or disadvantage over companies. We also allow for a process where companies can validate the data that we've put together, which sometimes makes the ranking in the innovation index different, because not every company obviously publishes all of their key milestone events. But if we think of innovation, then you can think about label expansions, life cycle management, being able to also make sure the molecule is, you could say, and the product is introduced in different indications. We think about how assets progress to the next stage in development, so being successful in meeting, you could say, clinical trial parameters. We look at study success, but also failures, termination, and the reasons for termination of different studies. And we look also at, you could say, the return on investment from the clinical trials. So also looking at R&D spend, effectiveness, and efficiency from pharma companies. Then additionally, also more qualitatively, we look at what's being published around collaborations with academia, patient organizations, how companies are tackling getting market access for their drugs, so that their products can reach as many patients as possible. If we then look into invention, we have a different set of metrics, which really looks at, you could say, novelty in terms of the pipeline, breadth and depth, in terms of the products that they might be able to bring to market, and how much promising drug designations there might be able to take forward. Also, what's looked into from an invention point of view is regulatory approvals. We look into, you could say, orphan indications, being able to achieve FDA breakthrough status, so kind of the full regulatory spectrum is considered. And then also here from an R&D point of view, looking into the level of investment and how that compares to our industry benchmark. Additionally, also qualitative information around anything that's communicated and shared in terms of news updates regarding their pipeline is relevant for us in terms of reviewing and evaluating the data. So now I'll hand over to Mike to really start going into the detail of this year's results.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Yeah, and let's click through. One of the stories that I talk about a lot, just because it's so interesting, is how the Beatles, for example, went from an unsigned covers band to, probably the greatest band that, the world had seen in 3 short years, writing songs that, 60 years later, still pretty remarkable, today. And we see that kind of change within our industry, pretty rapidly as well. But not enough credit goes to the kind of incremental innovations, the kind of small inventions, the ideas that are picked up and lived with. So as we look at innovation and invention, I think it's worth looking at the other stories for, the complexity. Rather than just this was this great band, it was obvious they were going to be a success. That clearly wasn't true for the Beatles. It's never been true in music. It's also very rarely true in our industry. So Jackie, if you click forwards one, please. The chart that many of you will have seen with the this year's Innovation and Invention Index is really meant to go back to that original question of, same molecule, 2 different companies, would they be equally successful? The reason that we dive as deep as we do is because it is a meaningful question. This is the job that all of us do every day, bringing molecules forward to market. And we want to know that we're doing it in the best way possible. But, actually, as we found 13 years ago, the number of articles dedicated to this subject were very few, right? The creation of pipelines, and people get excited about the science. But, creating value from those pipelines is not as well understood. But this chart, we see some new entrants in this chart. AstraZeneca, for example, doing incredibly well on invention. They've done remarkably well with partnerships and pioneers in digital health and so forth. Pfizer, the greatest number of approvals we've seen in many years across our industry. So clearly are going to do well in innovation. But, we see the importance of scientific and commercial kind of capabilities in Regeneron, companies like Sanofi behind Dupixent, one of the industry's more remarkable success stories. So if we click on to the top 10 tables, we see the kind of changes that some of us expected. Novo coming top was not a surprise for, I think, anybody that's been watching our industry for the last year. It probably was a surprise they came from where they were to where they are, to many people 3 years ago. But those of us who had watched them for a while had seen that they embraced what we call serendipity, and we'll come on to that a little bit more in time. Good to see GSK, rising again, a long-term powerhouse in the UK, coming back to prominence, largely off an oncology portfolio. Pfizer, who did well in the COVID years, continuing to do well with their portfolio since then. Lilly, following Novo up that ladder, but some drops. We've seen J&J is consistently, doing very well in this index, still doing very well. And this top 10 is the top 10 of a top 30, all of whom have had successes over the years. Jackie, if we click onto the Invention Index, J&J, one of the reasons that they will rise again is that they have a tremendous pipeline. Most of it built around oncology, but some rare diseases, some remarkable breakthroughs there as well. Merck, as you've seen with Keytruda, also investing those funds pretty well. BMS, Moderna, no surprise they're doing well. Again, reinvesting their COVID fortune. And probably the inclusion for the first time ever of Jiangsu Henry, the Chinese company, in the Invention Index. And this is something where we looked at this Chinese market and said, look, will it ever become a kind of innovator, inventor? And exactly the same way we discussed the Japanese market about 20 years ago, we are starting to see the rise of, Chinese invented medicines, making a difference to our landscape. So Jackie, if you click forwards one, please. Many of you, if you've read anything I've written about serendipity, there's this great belief that serendipity is the same as luck. Sometimes you stumble across a great asset and somehow you're able to do something with it. But, the old story of, the eureka moment of, discovering, how to weigh gold, if you like, needed a prepared mind. And we've seen that with the GLP-1s, for example, with Novo and the Gila monster, the venom of the Gila monster leading to GLP-1s, and then understanding how to market that in diabetes and obesity. It took its time. This wasn't an overnight success story for Novo, for Lilly. There were uncertainties in how to bring them to market, where to bring them to market. Even here, we've seen the difference between, regulatory standards and commercial standards for these exact same drugs. So how to craft a TPP, for example, for semaglutide was part of the kind of the remarkable story, but how it became, one of the, more, newsworthy efforts of our industry in recent years. So as we begin to unpack this kind of idea of what it is that leads to better decision making in early phase, I think it's important that serendipity has a prepared mind, waiting for when we see those moments. So Jackie, if we click forwards one, please. Many of you will also have seen, we published this chart a few times now, because, this essentially is a biosimilar market in the PD-1, PD-L1 space. But you look at the curves down towards the bottom right, people with the same molecule are continuing to spend in R&D, but you look at the kind of the cumulative revenue of Keytruda to the end of 23, $101 billion sitting in Keytruda. We forget that it was outlaunched, if you like, by Opdivo. Opdivo was by far the number one in that marketplace for 2 or 3 years, and it took another couple of years for Keytruda's revenue to really pay back the deficit it had at the beginning of time. But most people in this market knew this was a market that was coming. But AstraZeneca, Roche, and other companies, took their time. Pfizer, for example, took their time entering and even beginning to generate significant revenue. So we can see this question that we asked ourselves all those years ago is real. Companies do have the same drug at mostly the same time. Business development brings it into early stage pipelines. How quickly they get to market, how successfully they get to market. In Merck's case here, the ability to continue to add life cycle claims to an already successful market. And we're seeing that with the introduction of the IRA now, how many companies want to go broad quickly. So as soon as they launch, they suddenly get a raft of indications next to their names. So we do see this thought experiment playing out in the real world. And Jackie, if it clicks forwards one, everyone talks about our industry having this challenge, right, of old drugs potentially facing IRA challenges and other challenges as they get towards the end of their life. But this chart, which is a kind of subset of the innovation index, something we call the freshness index, and what this does is it looks at how much of last year's revenue comes from drugs that were launched in the last 3 or 5 years. And really, where you don't want to be down bottom left, you don't want to be down at 2%, 0% of your revenue coming from new drugs, because then all of your revenues are coming from drugs you launched more than 5 years ago, which are increasingly open to competition, but also open to genericization as we roll forward. So no one is surprised that maybe Moderna is one of the companies that does well in a chart that looks like this, because all of their revenues have come in the last 2 or 3 years. But we also see companies like Pfizer, AbbVie, Novo Nordisk, Lilly, doing relatively okay, above the 20% of revenues coming from new drugs. That's where you think a healthy company would be, and you can understand why some of the companies who are down at the bottom left, the Mercks, the Sanofis are starting to look at how they do innovation. So it's a revealing metric, because these companies are definitely feeling, they're pumping their Dupixents, hard for what they have left in order to pay for the new pipeline. And you also see some of these companies are doing well in the invention index, but learning how to launch is clearly going to be a kind of, very important dimension for these companies as they roll forwards. Jackie, shall I hand back to you?
Yes, thank you, Mike. So what we want to do now is just give you an overview of some of the insights we found looking into our data set regarding how the industry has been trying to improve, you could say, innovation and bringing rich pipelines to market. So some of the key questions that we look to answer is like, which companies have improved innovation rankings systematically over the years? So which companies have been continuously have had high scores? What have they done right? And what strategies have they implemented at an organizational and functional level to drive this sustained progress in innovation? So over the years, we've had 48 pharmaceutical companies included in the Innovation Index. Johnson & Johnson is the company with the most #1 rankings in the index, as you can see the years listed here. And Pfizer has topped the Innovation Index twice within the last 3 years, obviously really driven through the work they've done for the COVID vaccine. But our top 5 of, you could say, top performer companies is based on how many times they've been in, you could say, the #1 score, top scores for the Innovation Index. So besides Johnson and Pfizer, we also see Roche, Merck and Co, obviously with Keytruda, AstraZeneca and Gilead. Then in terms of, you could say, what do these companies do right, is if we think of let's say AstraZeneca as the first one, is that they have continuously focused on leveraging strategic partnerships, both academic, but also looking into cutting edge technologies and being bold in their approach to digital innovation. Opening rich campuses in terms of R&D facilities, but also allowing for processes that bring cross-functional teams together in early stage clinical development. And that is one of the key things that we see differentiates, you could say, top performers from some of the companies that would be more at the bottom of the chart, is that they do really have an integrated approach in terms of the cross-functional drug development process. So commercial inputs are provided early in terms of R&D, because already early stage, leaders are making decisions about what to take forward, what the shape of a TPP will look like, and ultimately what the potential of the product in the market will be. Pfizer, on the other hand, has really embraced, you could say, an organizational structure that allows for agility, and were some of the first ones that started to think also differently about bringing technologies into their drug development process, building different commercial infrastructures for different, you could say, specialty business units. And they focus really on, you could say, the most pressing global healthcare challenges. And that's also something, if we really look at the innovators in the list, is these are not companies that you could say follow or look for opportunity where everyone is looking, you could say under the light under the lamppost, but really go and explore novel places and take a certain amount of uncertainty and risk within their portfolio.
Yeah,
Mike, would there be anything you want to add here?
I was just going to say, I mean, if we go back to Pascal Soriot's kind of tenure at AstraZeneca and the kind of the disbelief when he made bold claims for the company, and if you remember, Mene Pangalos published his 5 R's framework for how they were going to assess the right drug, the right market, and so forth. I think we've seen this kind of idea that excellence is what we do repeatedly, bear fruit in what we've seen from AstraZeneca. I don't think anyone really expected, Pascal's bet with the market to play out quite as well as it has. But this has been a consistently performing company. Same with Pfizer. We do look back at the COVID years as as significant ones for Pfizer. The biggest drug the industry has ever seen in Comirnaty. But Pfizer, to be there where they were, had to be ready to be agile, to be ready to launch, to ready to do the studies. And that takes process investigation and reinvention before you get there, because you can't just reinvent overnight. So both good examples of companies who had built on their processes, built on their ways of doing business, to be able to capitalize during COVID, but more generally in areas like oncology.
Thanks, Mike. And I just also got a question in terms of how to read the chart. So it might look counterintuitive with the line going downward, but on the left-hand side, you can see the ranking going from 0 to 30, or kind of higher up in terms of the scores that we provide. So the lower scores are indeed the high performers on innovation. So the downward trend here is a clear signal of continuous high scores and performance on innovation. If we then look into 2 other companies, we can see that you could say, if you look at the trend line here, they're more stable, more even out. So although our industry likes to look at averages in terms of, okay, do we have an average pharma company? When we really would start to unpack this, there's no such thing. We can look at R&D spend, R&D effectiveness, number of regulatory approvals. But if we take BMS in this case, also what we can see here is that, especially in the last 5 years, they've dramatically improved, or sorry, 4 years, they dramatically improved their innovation scores, partly also because of the acquisition with Celgene, but also in, you could say, starting to introduce novel therapies, for instance, for cardiovascular disease in very niche patient populations. Then if we take Sanofi, and Mike already touched upon it, in terms of the average innovation trend, this is where we see a company that's been typically more traditionally organized in terms of how they structured the different functions and the input from commercial into R&D. But obviously Dupixent and being able to combine Sanofi's commercial infrastructure and capabilities with Regeneron's scientific engine has really been a great success for people living with different immunological diseases. Mike, anything you would like to add here on these two companies?
Yeah, I think maybe rather than pulling out BMS and Sanofi in particular, because they have benefited from good BD recently as well as other areas, is just how important it is that we go back to this innovation invention kind of idea. Because one thing we've seen is companies that do have a strong focus on R&D, it can be great. You can see companies do incredibly well with gaining record numbers of approvals. The challenge is when you're launching drugs that are not becoming commercially successful, that then you start to question, why you're developing the drugs that you're developing, because you can certainly integrate those, as some of the companies at the top of our charts have shown. Launching commercially, valuable drugs is a discipline that requires R&D and commercial and market access of the groups to work together from really very early phase. Not many companies actually have that as a working process now. So R&D, traditionally delivers drugs a lot further along their pipelines than the more successful companies that we've seen in our index. BMS and Sanofi have both had positive trends in recent years in both of those dimensions.
Something that we put together is in terms of, you could say, the take-home questions if you want to discuss pharmaceutical innovation and invention at your company. So obviously looking more broadly, because that's a question we quite often get, is how do we improve our scores? What are all of these different companies doing? And obviously, as we just discussed, there's not necessarily one golden recipe, although there are these key insights around that Mike touched upon in terms of commercial and R&D working together, stable R&D spend that we see, as well as, you could say, looking for opportunity and explore this before it's finalized and goes in further in the development process. So looking at the different strategies that your company is implementing, both on an organizational level, but also functional and cross-functional, to really create this innovation-rich culture and creative thinking about what a product could be and what the market could look like, because the best products have created new markets that did not exist today, and that requires imagination and not just an analytical process. If we think about what external market opportunities your company is already leveraging that drive innovation internally, thinking about, you could say, different partnerships in terms of R&D or digital or commercial that could be expanded upon, or could you run small experiments, all for the process of learning. And we always say the molecule that you have in the lab and that you launch into the market are the same. It's really about what you learn in between. So that's something that we see as a culture and mindset that really fosters innovation in pharma companies. Then also, has the organization set an innovation target? And how do we measure innovation? Obviously, you can take our Pharmaceutical Innovation and Invention Index as a source of inspiration in terms of how we view innovation. But also it's about a more challenging question around how do we incentivize innovation within our company? It's not just about, you could say, improving cycle times or achieving clinical trial milestones. It's really about thinking what comes out and on the other end, and our patients, our healthcare professionals, will they be able to achieve the outcomes they want and need? And then also thinking about, what is the number of new products launched, expansions in specific therapy areas? Sometimes we come in companies where different therapy areas are not really talking to each other, although from a product perspective, there could be great potential and synergies created working on the same molecule, but really thinking different about, you could say, the diseases, or not the diseases we treat, but the patients we're actually treating. So that's something that we wanted to make sure you keep in mind as well. Mike, is there anything you would add to this?
Well, actually, there's a question that's coming from Michelle.
Okay. Yeah.
About whether, how many of the companies have formal life cycle management processes and how that correlates. I think it's an interesting question, Michelle, because we do notice, well, pretty much every company has a life cycle management approach, whether it's a healthy one or not, whether it's a kind of McKinsey standard generic process, or whether it's more meaningful. is a sort of big question, because one of the things, and I know some of the companies you've worked in before, they don't focus hard enough on phase one and what the what the life cycle indication strategy is going to be for that drug. But we sort of link that to our philosophy about, everyone in the industry knows the TPP as a process, and it's mostly a sort of hated process for, killing innovation. And I think it does. One of the things that we recommend most companies do is that they don't work with one TPP, but at least 5 by the time they leave phase one and go into phase two, so that you can answer questions, address different endpoints, address different patient unmet needs. Because actually the least that you'll ever know about your drug is when you leave phase one. You're gathering information about your drug, you're gathering information about your market, and so many other things. So for you to have made a decision before that actually means that you're making a decision in the absence of any meaningful information, but where the drug could fit, whether it's going to address the unmet needs in that marketplace or not. So we do like companies to have diversity in their TPP approach before they get there. And I think that is something that we see in companies when they have a better lifecycle management approach, which is where might we launch first and where might we launch second. As we said with Keytruda, that was clearly a successful approach for them to add as many indications as possible. After that, whether Keytruda is a better drug than Imfinzi, who knows? If you put them in the same study, in the same population, which one would win? We'll never know, because Merck were the first ones to do it, and they really got that that information moving forwards. But I think that I think the conversation we had before about the connectedness of your R&D and commercial colleagues is, if you want a commercially successful drug, we have to be giving that as a target for the R&D organization, because it can't be a blind, R&D development that somehow wants to shoehorn in a commercial ambition after that. This has to be a joint exercise, and that makes so much sense intuitively, but not many companies have that ability to kind of combine those two things.
And there's one comment to think about how innovation can be linked to pandemic preparedness, because I guess the only certainty we'll have is that there will be another pandemic in a certain point in time. Mike, what would be your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, like we said before about AstraZeneca and Pfizer, who've traditionally done very well here, the behaviors that tend to lead to good pandemic preparedness were also ones that tended to lead to good commercial effectiveness and so forth. So, scanning of landscapes for opportunity, being ready to, drive clinical trial innovation, which is something we don't cover in this index, but we do cover in a different index. How ready you are to scale clinical trials, early phase trials, where you're running them, how ready you are to kind of to go fast if needs be. Because one of the things we talk about with path to market is, even seeing the same market opportunity as somebody else at the same time, there are ways to get there faster and in better shape. Companies that spend their time on those processes tend to do better than companies that don't. So those cultures, the flexibility, the mobility of the company, that can be baked into the way that those companies work, instead of just doing the same thing you did 10 years ago. There are new ways that, you see companies like Amgen, for example, that are, leaders in AI now in their clinical groups, that you expect to be shortening development times, making them more cost effective. So the more cost effective your R&D is, the kind of better it can be as well. But maybe just to pull up Peter's question in individual decision makers and cultures of the company, Bill Anderson of Bayer has driven a it's pretty rapid change in the culture there, towards a more effective decision-making organization. And I think, as you said before, the decisions are really the kind of critical difference between companies, the decision to go forward or the decision to pause, how to integrate a portfolio, what that looks like, which drugs to give your money to and which drugs to keep your money away from. But importantly, efficiency and effectiveness outcomes as well in those R&D organizations clearly does matter very much so. As I said, with the example of Pascal, and Mene, Pangalos at AstraZeneca, that was a very big change in their culture. And they felt their culture came first, so they needed that bold decision-making culture before they could become successful as organizations.
Yeah, and I think, Mike, to your point is also with what we see with Bayer, that it needs to start with the top right, is that they also enable and empower teams to think differently and to really set the parameters for decision making. And what we see and have seen in Bayer also is that obviously it really transitions from teams that need to provide one answer about what might be right. It's really about looking and exploring optionality and then thinking about the decisions that need to be made and what information is required. So that really puts a different dynamic in product teams and in conversations if they can be in that mindset.
And I go back to my example of the Beatles very early on. You know, the great news about, I wrote a piece about Revolver and how many people contributed, you know, essentially were playing on the album Revolver by the Beatles. And there was something like 37 different musicians contributed to Revolver. And the great thing about them was somebody said, who's the greatest decision maker in the Beatles? And somebody said, look, Ringo's probably the greatest decision maker in the Beatles. You know, John and Paul, they write most of the songs. You know, George certainly contributes, but Ringo usually says whether it's good or not. And actually that decision itself, is this a good song or not, was often the one that they found the hardest to kind of get their heads around. So giving it to somebody else, or to George Martin, or to an external producer. And we see that within pharma companies. You know, do you have a decision maker on your portfolio who can really say this drug's going to be successful or not? Do you trust the teams feeding them information or not? You know, those kind of things do become very critical to companies, because, you know, no head of R&D is singularly successful for getting a drug through. In many cases, including, you know, one of the people asking the questions today, you know, we've seen drugs that were disliked or put on a shelf by their organization come through to be hailed as the greatest launch that company's ever had after that, because of, you know, some successful side steps, different indication choices, you know, different approach to commercializing the drug. So I do think we need to give credit to some of those decision makers in the companies.
Thank you, Mike. And I see Peter has put his hand up. Feel free to come off mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, rather than typing, I thought I'd just post the question. So I think this whole process of innovation, as you also pointed out in the beginning with regard to serendipity, which is not just a matter of luck, it's also of good observations. And it's a little bit around the question I was asking, you know, individual decision makers or how the company culture is. And of course, they go hand in hand. You cannot see them separately, but you can look at companies which have been successful and companies who have been not so successful. I just typed into the box, if you look at the history of Keytruda, that was almost given away.
Yes. Yeah.
That was clearly not observed. Came out of my good old company, Organon, where I worked. But I have a question too with regard to improving the decision-making process. And I'm going to use the word that everybody hates these days because there's so many companies that say this is the next revolution. It's called AI. But I'm thinking more practical of how to leverage the data that is out there in a company, mostly often, and also it's publicly available. That, to be honest, if you're looking at processes going from discovery and development, it's also almost not handleable anymore. And even if you're looking at portfolio management, the diversity of the data and the density of the data is almost not manageable by any human being anymore. I'm just curious with regard to better implementations where you have to put a little bit more faith in using, let's say, machine learning or machine systems to help you make the decisions, where you would then have to rely on that the decision has been made on more data than you can comprehend. What is your view of AI being utilized better than it's done now?
It's a great question, Peter, and you're right. A lot of companies are using it, not all of them loudly and externally. A lot of them are using it internally and to you know, inform better decision making, as you say. So your first thing, you're right. I mean, no company can tell you in phase one that a drug's going to be successful or not, but you can change the percentages slightly and in your favor, you know, to address the literature, to address other targets. You know, non-druggable targets suddenly become druggable, you know, based on some of the AI technologies. But more widely than that, the way that you're making decisions about, time to market, for example, there are companies, Exploristics is a great example, that can help you plan, your way through clinical studies, where to put them for the greatest chance of success. Some of those probabilities of technical success do derive from your ability to leverage, the best information for where to put the study, how likely it is to read out positively, just based on that kind of metric. So I think you're right. Any company that's not using as much of the downloaded information as possible is clearly missing a trick. You can't just go back to, gut feel and instinct anymore. There's a piece I wrote a little while ago about how many shots, Roger Federer wins. And it's a surprisingly low number because he wins a lot of games, but he only wins 54% of the shots in all of those games that he's played. And actually, that's a very high number for tennis players. So he's only winning 1 in 2 shots. And pharma tends to believe in the same metrics. It's hard. Attrition takes care of things. We expect 90% attrition in phase 1, slightly less as you go through. But we're still seeing 50% attrition in phase 3, which is really not the time to be having attrition, bear upon our drugs. So companies are using AI, not necessarily for better molecule spotting, but for better process and decision making on the way through. And it seems odd that you would not use a calculator, given that they exist, to do your calculations these days.
Great, thanks, Mike. And Peter, thanks for a great, thoughtful question. There was one question also, if companies can improve their innovation score through BD&L activities, and the answer is yes. So we also look into that, you could say, in terms of milestones and partnerships. But ultimately, obviously, the innovation score then is also about what these companies do with these activities in terms of how they make them successful. So that's something that we then follow and probably will start to really count when they will be able to introduce the assets into the market from any BD&L.
Yeah, and again, I wrote a piece recently about Humira and Lipitor, both of which were, business developed into the company. Park Davis, Cambridge Antibody Technology. Humira is the biggest drug our industry's ever seen in terms of revenue. But, that was licensed in. Why you would prefer your in-house discovery engine now over an external discovery engine, which has often taken its own bets on the drugs to bring it in. The question is when you bring it in and whether you're overpaying. So we do treat all elements of a pipeline equally once they're in your pipeline. But if your goal is to expensively acquire drugs in late stage, that's a clearly very different strategy than if you're acquiring, newer drugs with, potential, and then you're doing a lot of development work after that. But the ability to point a drug towards a great market, clearly is more open to you if you do that earlier. But yes, absolutely, the innovation score as the creation of added value, it does play a kind of a part in the innovation index.
Thank you. And then a question regarding what role does diversity, and I think this is probably trial population diversity in clinical trial plays in the innovation success.
So I don't think there's a direct track from clinical trial diversity. We do monitor, clinical trial metrics, especially in our CNS Summit Innovation Index, because that's a clear cut, clinical trial behavior score. But you would expect, if you followed the logic through, the innovation will come from studying, probably diverse populations, and that's not just the DEI scores, but are you studying, do you have the right inclusion of women and different, socioeconomic groups? Have you gone to the right centers where those diseases are, evident in your clinical trials? Because we do see a direct track between doing clinical studies in the right places and then commercial success when those drugs launch. So, investigators having familiarity with the drug before launch there is a clear track there, but the kind of diversity scores that we measure through bioethics and our clinical trial innovation scores, which are presented in November, is definitely something that we look at.
Great, thank you, Mike. And also a great point regarding the previous conversation from Michelle about truth-seeking behaviors and rewarding that as a good predictor for decision-making is something we see as well. It's more really about making sure the assumptions get aired, and then you can challenge, pressure test these assumptions or find more evidence and then make updates. So that's definitely a practice that we see works well as well.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that, so truth-seeking, we see it going hand in hand with question, asking. One of the best things we see companies do is ask questions of the molecule early, because you don't know the answer until you ask the question. But not enough companies ask enough questions of their molecule early enough. That's definitely a component of truth-seeking behavior. Is there a market, and does the drug work? Both of those things could be asked in greater diversity in early stage.
Great, thanks. And then there's one question in terms of what role does having a balanced pipeline through the phases contribute to sustainability? Obviously, there's different ways to look at sustainability. Mike, do you have a view on this?
Mostly, I look at economics to sustainability because you don't want to see companies going through rises and falls. And I think, as you showed in your charts, Jackie, we've seen companies do sustainably well in our indices over the years. Having a pipeline that's ready to fill in the kind of the troughs when those drugs go generic. That's clearly one way to look at economic sustainability. But as you get into the really expensive end of the spectrum in phase 3 and on market, doing studies that work is clearly a kind of major component of becoming successful. Having studies that work tends to lead to commercial success as well. So the better we can make the phase 3 and phase 4 processes, the healthier all of our companies are going to be. It's been great, even on the consulting side, just seeing how many companies now require of us that we can point to kind of green and sustainable, performance standards, before we're allowed to become a supplier to those companies. So it's clear that our industry is taking the lead on environmental sustainability as well as economic sustainability.
Yes, thank you. And I think with that, and it's been great to have all of your questions and also insights, because that's really founded a great discussion for today. So with that, in terms of, you could say, the data that we've presented, as Mike has talked about, serendipity, what we do see, thinking about serendipity and building a serendipitous scientific engine, so allowing for exploration of options and uncertainty, combined with a strong commercial engine that also thinks about novel ways of bringing your product to market, is really what drives pharmaceutical success. And that's what we see across our data, across the companies that continuously perform well. So with that, just want to share our contact details. If you have any further questions or insights you would like to share, we'll also make the recording of this webinar available. And I've also seen some requests for the white paper to be received. Additionally, what we also offer is you could say, company-specific lunch and learns, where we could really deep dive on your company's data in terms of the index on innovation and invention, and also how it relates to other companies in the index. So with that, thank you all. Mike, just over to you for a few.
No, please do email, follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn. You'll see that we're probably more prepared to answer questions than you want to ask them. We're very prepared to go in depth on anything you see here, because we do believe that treating invention and innovation as separate focal points for the industry really makes a big difference. So yeah, please do make connections.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of the day and evening.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.